Hey there, AP Hug team. This is Population Part 2, and in this segment of the Flip Lecture, we're going to go ahead and focus on Standard C, which is the cause and consequences of migration are influenced by cultural, demographic, economic, environmental, and political factors. So, of course, as we become more linked together, our ability to move across the Earth's surface, is more accessible to people. So, as geographers, when we're talking about migration is the process of permanently moving from your home region and crossing an administrative border or boundary, such as between counties or states or different countries. So when we talk about migration, we want to tie it to, we call them push and pull factors. So on the screen right now, we have some examples of push factors. So push factors are usually negative influences that make a person want to move, such as high taxes, high crime rates, abusive governments, among others. Then we also have things called pull factors. And pull factors we can think of are positive influences that actually pull a person towards a particular place, such as affordable real estate or good schools or clean parks. Now, when we talk about migration, we talk about voluntary migration versus forced migration. So voluntary migration occurs when migrants have the option whether to move or not, basically. So we have something called step migration, which basically follows stages in a final destination. So we could see, for example, if you're going from a farm town, maybe you're going up to a local village, and you're going to go over to an urban city. So it kind of moves in those steps versus something also we introduced in the unit called chain migration. So chain migration streams often develop because of information exchange. So people in the place of origin might hear like these great, amazing opportunities in this new place, or maybe like they have family members in the new community, and if they see an advertisement or they hear their friends and family talking about the place, that might necessarily attract people to come. So chain migration occurs when people migrate to be with other people who have migrated before them and whom they have some sort of linkage. So that's kind of the trick, think of chain link, whether it's financial, whether it's religious, whether it's ethnic, cultural, and some other type of connection. So chain migration also, once you kind of tie that to our discussion of ethnic enclaves. So again, we see, people that come over and feel very comfortable speaking their language, ethnic food, ethnic diversity, ethnic homogeneous, because again, we have that enclave community. Now in this section, you should have a little bit of historical background. You should definitely be familiar with historical migrations. So we talk about Africa to America, talking about the transatlantic slave trade, which is an example of a forced migration. We also have waves of immigration into the United States. So the United States, you could say, has three major waves of immigration originating from different parts of the world. In the colonial era, which was roughly around 1600s to 1776, Europe and Africa were the primary source of migrants, both voluntary and involuntary, to the New World. Many Europeans were fleeing political and religious persecution, where, like we mentioned earlier, Africans were forced to come over as African slaves. Now, later in the 19th century saw continued migration from Europe. Before 1840s, most immigrants in America originated in England. But in the 1840s and 1850s, massive numbers of Irish and Germans migrated across the Atlantic in search of opportunity. More than 4.2 million people actually migrated to the U.S. during this wave, which is more than twice since colonization. Immigration slumped, if we go back, think about 8th grade Civil War. So that actually was a downward in United States migration, but surged again in the early 20th century, and this is fueled by the Industrial Revolution. So new migrants in the 1900s came not only from the northern and western, but now areas like Italy and Austria-Hungary and Russia. Unrestricted immigration to the United States was halted by the Quota Act, which is in 1921, which allowed higher numbers of immigrants from European countries and discriminated against Asians in other regions. Now, during the Great Depression and World War II, immigration to the United States dropped off quite dramatically, but reached new heights again during the 1980s and 1990s. Now, during the 70s and 80s, Asia was leading the source of immigration, when we think about, for example, immigration from Vietnam, which was one of the leads during that time period. By the late 1980s, Latin America was the leading source of immigrants to the United States. Now, some U.S. immigrants are guest workers temporarily allowed in the United States with work permits. Many United States immigrants actually we talked about something called remittances, which is basically money transactions are sent home by guest workers to family members in other countries. Guest workers perform many different types of economic functions for the United States, from farming, from working in large corporations and universities. All right, on this particular slide, you need to be familiar in the migration section. You need to be familiar with Ravenstein's migration laws. By the late 1800s, the British geographer Ernst Ravenstein identified some generalizations about migration. So some of them we can still apply to modern conditions of migration. So kind of the basics, a majority of migrants travel short distances. Most migrants travel in step migration, when a person has a long distance goal in mind, but kind of achieves it in small steps. Migrants who are traveling a long way tend to move to large cities rather than smaller cities, and we talked about some pull factors, jobs, opportunities. Rural residents in the country are more likely to migrate to urban residents. Again, during Ravenstein's era, many rural residents were packing up and moving to the cities for the industrial jobs and bright opportunities. Today, this kind of generalization varies by region. China, which is currently industrializing, is experiencing this trend. Remember, China, as we classified, is NIC, newly industrializing country, or one of our BRICS. So also part of this, again, families are less likely to migrate across national borders than young adults. So for the most part, one of the key things to remember is Ravenstein asserted that it's easier for single people to migrate than for whole families. And he also says, again, it's more likely that most migrants are going to be male, because they're going to basically, again, adult males that are going to be sending back money and support to their families back in their home countries. Okay, here's a model that we could also tie to our discussion of migration, which is something called the gravity model. Now, geographers use the gravity model to estimate the spatial interaction and movement between two places. This is known as gravity, and you probably heard gravity, of course, in your science class. This ties to, again, Sir Isaac Newton's theory of gravitational pull. So basically, the gravity model predicts that larger places attract more migrants than smaller places, just as larger planets have more gravitational pull. It also predicts that the closer places attract more migrants than more distant places. In all, the gravity model proposes an equation that kind of balances out distance and size, trying to predict spatial patterns. So for example, the model could be used to predict higher numbers of Mexicans choosing to migrate to the United States than to England, because the friction of distance factors. The United States is obviously just simply closer for Mexicans than it is England, and tied to friction of distance. Again, the farther we're away from something, again, less spatial interaction. Now, this model can be helpful for predicting migration patterns, but just like all of our models, it has limitations. It does not factor in migration selectivity factors such as age or educational level, and human behavior does not always fit, obviously, as we know as humans, in predicted patterns. All right, also in this section, I want to make sure I mention, so we mentioned earlier in regards to voluntary migration, we also have something called involuntary migration, aka forced migration. And this is where migrants are actually pushed from their land. Now, the largest forced migration we mentioned earlier was the North Atlantic slave trade, and this forced nearly 30 million Africans from their homes and forced them to migrate to the Americas. And when we talk about forced migration, we could also talk about one of our vocab terms known as a refugee. Refugees are migrants basically fleeing some sort of persecution or abuse. Now, international refugees flee their country and move to another country, while intra-national or internally displaced people refugees abandon their homes but remain in their countries. So just kind of clarifying that again, if I'm internally displaced, maybe again from Southern California, maybe I'm again migrate to Northern California because again there was some sort of war or natural disaster. So that would be, again, looking more in intra-national migration. But if I actually have to, flee California, cross over to Mexico, again, because there was some sort of war or conflict, or again, some major situation that happens, that would actually be a refugee situation where Mexico would have to take in refugees. So some major regions that you should be familiar with that could be popping up on the exam. Looking at Africa, millions of people have fled Rwanda and the Congo in response to tribal or ethnic conflicts. In the region of Darfur, the region northeastern Sudan, religious and ethnic tensions in north and south, Muslims and the government rebels have led to a massive dislocation. Tanzania, Uganda, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Angola have seen large numbers of war-related refugees. In the Middle East, a large stream of ethnic Palestinians migrated to neighboring countries such as Jordan, Syria, Egypt. Of course, again, when we talked about political dislocations, include the Kurdish people from former Iraq and Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation in the 1980s. In Europe, the fall of Yugoslavia and the Balkans led to the largest refugee crisis since World War II. Nearly 7 million refugees fled their home in this conflict. Talked about before, again, with the waves of migration for historically, if we're looking at Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War created nearly 2 million refugees. Cambodia's violent government transition resulted in 30,000 refugees. Of course, again, more of a current example, potentially could be on the AP exam in the next few years, is looking at the Syrian refugee crisis. So lots of examples to pull forward to make sure you understand and can identify the concept of forced migration refugee situation. All right, and then last but not least, you should be familiar with the course migration consequences. So a few on the screen that you can maybe think about is we have the spread of language. So when we talked about, for example, the diffusion of English, when we talked about England colonizing, even the 13 colonies in America, again, one of the ways that English diffused. We could talk about the diffusion of religions, how that's going to spread, element or basics of culture. Innovation ideas, so again, bringing new ideas, new technology. And we could also, again, say the diffusion of diseases, thinking about, again, colonial examples, bringing things like smallpox, native tribes. So migration also has negative, you could say positive and negative consequences. All right, with that being said, that will be kind of a quick run through of some basic key concepts for migration. So make sure you have this down in your core concepts packet, and we'll go ahead and continue migration in class. All right, you guys, I'll see you in class.